lecture or series of lectures. I'm actually going to talk about two different things. I want to start with talking about the psychology of warfare. And I should say this was my subject for my Master of Philosophy degree at Cambridge. I then want to move on and take the lessons that I think come out of this particular lecture through to coercion, which I say is a modern paradigm of war. I should say, of course, that anything I may say or be quoted as having said does not reflect Her Majesty's government opinion in the slightest. In fact, most of them have never heard of it. So that's basically the structure of what we're going to do. I will aim to have a 15-minute break between the two, and then if we can leave the questions, please, to the end, and then we can have a discussion about psychology and interstate relations as one complete access point. I have to say this is probably the most misunderstood phenomenon of war that there is. Most people will tell you they know everything about warfare, but when it comes to understanding the psychology of warfare, they by and large do not understand it. The great generals of this world generally do. But a lot of people who wear 4-star or 5-star rank, although they seem to be very important, have no idea about psychology. And the problem is that they tend to think that warfare is a science. That if you measure how many laser-guided bombs you need to hit various targets with, then this will happen, or that will happen. And they tend to have a very simplistic approach. Well, I'd suggest to you that actually this is the bit that warfare is all about. This is the bit that people like Alexander the Great would have understood completely. Napoleon probably understood it pretty well. Hitler, on the other hand, probably did not understand it particularly well. So this is the art of warfare. Everything else, the number of weapons you need to take out, 3.97, blah, 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 targets, is the science. This is the real art of warfare. And this is the point that we really need to take on board. So my contention is that war is actually about people's minds. So I want you to forget everything else you know about warfare, but think minds, because that's what it's really all about. Let me just give you a thought for a second. This is a group of models you can see found in a grave in Middle Kingdom, Egypt, about 1500 BC. Fairly impressive group of people, as you can see, armed with shields and fairly impressive spears. And certainly if you were a peasant living in a village and this lot turned up, you would have to be very impressed, and you'd probably do pretty much what they wanted to say. But then imagine this little group when they went onto a battlefield and suddenly, here we are, Battle of Kadesh, 1274, there's Ramses the Great, and suddenly he's churning around the battlefield with one of these jobbers. Capable of moving at about 30 miles an hour, firing, well, up to 30 arrows per minute, range of the arrows up to about 100 yards, probably fired more like at 50 yards. Against the spearmen, they could do virtually nothing against it. They could stand and wait. They could throw their spears but miss. If they had arrows, generally they would miss as well. The only lucrative target there is actually the horses. So these people could move around the battlefield, come into contact, fire a volley of arrows, and move away and come in from a different angle. This is, does anyone know what that is? What group that comes from? Gives you a little bit of a clue. 1120 Cappadocia. Any offers on that? Okay, that's the Assyrians. So we're talking about Nineveh, we're talking about Tiglath-Pileser I, as this particular chap was, as everybody will remember. You'll notice that because they're operating in northern Iraq, it's obviously a little bit more mountainous, a little bit difficult going. 3 horses opposed to 2. We now have somebody with a shield. The composite bow has moved on a bit, as you'd expect, from 1274 down to 1120. So this is slightly more vulnerable, perhaps, than Ramses II's little chariots. You can imagine the effect of these on infantry tactics throughout the Middle East, and indeed these sorts of weapons dominated warfare for at least 500 years. And the history of warfare in that particular period is the history of the chariot. Very, very effective. The Egyptians could dismantle their chariots within 2 minutes. They could then put the wheels onto the backs of the horses and then swim them across a river while dragging the chariot and then reassemble it in 2 or 3 minutes on the other side. We're talking about extreme mobility. This is the attack helicopter of 1200 BC. So you better watch out if one of these things takes. Well, you can see the obvious psychological impact of something like this, but I want, before I go on too much, just to consider some different battles and look at different situations. This demonstrates the overwhelming asymmetry of a particular weapon. but I want to look inside the mind of a particular group of people. Now, those of you that were assiduous filmgoers a couple of years ago would have seen this particular film, 300. And as you can see, that's Ken Leonidas, however much you will. And of course, he was the man, as we all know, that defended the pass at Thermopylae. Now, as you probably recall, this was not a particularly good film. It was lost somewhere between sci-fi and real history. But nevertheless, it does show that when he defended with his other nation-states, defended the pass of Thermopylae, which is shown here, a great big mountain on the left-hand side, a very narrow strip, and then dropped to the sea on the right. The great king Xerxes, of course, had come from the north, come all the way across the Hellespont, and this was essentially the only way into Greece, as I'm sure you'll recall. They fought for 3 days, and then eventually they were never defeated on their battle line, but they were outflanked, as I'm sure you'll recall. The Immortals were moved around to the south, and they then outflanked the Greeks. Leonidas said he would send away those that could be sent away, and he and 300 Spartans, or those that were left, decided to continue to fight for one more day. And at the end of the day, as you recall, they withdrew up onto the hill. They had fought the Persians into a standstill, and at this stage the Persian morale went down, and they decided they would not close with the Greeks anymore, and fired on the Greeks, who by this stage had no longer any shields. Most of them had lost their helmets. Almost all of them were wounded, and they were fighting with tooth and nail against the Persians. So the Persians withdrew and then finished the Greeks off with arrows. Now, psychologically, that's had a huge effect on the Persian morale, as I'm sure you'll imagine. The fact that these people were so dedicated. At the end of the war, I'm sure you'll know, a memorial was put up. This is actually a later memorial, but there's Leonidas, as you can see. And they then put up this particular quote: "Tell them in Sparta, passerby, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." They did just what was asked of them. They were expected to go there, to give their lives willingly, and to fight and die in a cause. As you'll probably recall, only those that had children were allowed to go because they had succeeded. They had, produced a new generation, and so they went and gave their all and did exactly what was expected of them. Indeed, as you saw from this bit, tonight we dine in hell. Actually, he said, "Eat well, tonight we dine in Hades," which is not quite hell, but there we are. This is Americanization of a particular event. So this is the Spartans. These were the people who were the product of a military training ethos that makes Sandhurst, Cranwell, and West Point pale into insignificance. The Agoge. These people were pulled from birth to go to war, and they were extremely competent and willing to die. But yet, I want to move forward, not from Marathon, which took place around about there, where I'm pointing, to Pylos and Sancteria, because just 55 years later, the same product of the same education found themselves confronted by a set of circumstances that did not work too well. And let me just talk it through. You will recall that, of course, Athens was conducting what we now call a Periclean strategy, and it was this: that while Sparta, which was dominant on land, could ravage Attica at will, the essence, as far as the Athenians was concerned, was to get their fleet and move into the Spartan rear in order to cause hurt and damage, so that the Spartans could be persuaded not to continue their attacks on Athens. And indeed, that was going on and happening on a regular basis. And in 425, this is after Pericles had died, by the way, died, as I'm sure you recall, of the plague, the strategos elect, one Demosthenes, had decided that he would take an expedition. This is a picture taken looking southwards now, so it's the wrong way around. Take an expedition around the bottom of the Peloponnese and move down towards this area to Naupactus to support an Athenian ally. For reasons various, most notably the fact they were caught in a storm, Demosthenes found himself beleaguered on this little promontory near a place called Pylos, and this is the town of Pylos, you can see here. So, not wishing to lose the opportunity, he invaded Pylos, set up a camp, and protected himself. He sent away the remaining ships that he had, and off they went to join the main fleet, which was up at Corfu. Well, of course, as far as the Spartans were concerned, the fact that Demosthenes had positioned himself just to the west of Sparta, on the Peloponnese, was entirely unacceptable. So King Agis, of course the Spartan king, who was ravaging Attica at the time, was recalled, The Spartan fleet was activated, and everybody started moving towards Pylos to kick Demosthenes out. So the Spartan fleet arrived, moved into the lagoon, they disgorged troops, and you can see set up a camp right opposite Demosthenes in this area here. At the same time, they decided to put 400 hoplites on this island here, which is called Sphacteria. Now, if you read this is all in Thucydides. I can't remember which page it's on, but I'm sure you'll be able to find it without too much difficulty. So the Spartans have now put Demosthenes in a very beleaguered position. A big fortification there, a fleet in the lagoon, and of course taking the island of Sphacteria to the south. They then carried out an attempted invasion, which did not go well because the Athenians were quite well organised, they had quite well defended themselves, and so the Spartans pulled back, licking their wounds, trying to decide what to do next. Unfortunately for the Spartans, at just this time, what should come into view? But of course the Athenian fleet. The Athenian fleet moved into the lagoon, engaged the Spartan fleet, defeated it, and then landed a huge number of marines and rowers ashore. And now, of course, the whole balance of power in the area has changed. Now, of course, the Spartans, with their fortification, find themselves beleaguered, and most particularly the people, of course, on Sphacteria can neither get off the island nor do anything else, because Athens now has control of the lagoon and has control of all the waterways. At the same time, after this happened, there was a brush fire on Sphacteria. Sphacteria is a fairly long, low island with hills on either side, a little bit of a hollow in the middle, but it has a lot of thorn bushes. And a brush fire went from south to north all the way out through the island. So you still had the thorn bushes there, but without any leaves. And it's a lot of ash and a lot of dust, and very difficult to move. But the decision was taken by the Athenians that they would now invade Sphacteria in order to relieve the people on top at Pylos. So the invasion took place and marines were landed here. You'll recall there were 420 Spartans, and the Athenians landed, well, at least 800 hoplites. But in addition to that, they landed an awful lot of archers and an awful lot of slingers, maybe another 800 as well, so probably about 1,600. So the Spartans, of course, with 400, are relatively outnumbered. But what then happened is that the Athenians then started to move in towards the centre, and the Spartans, who had a little fortification up here, moved down to the south, and they met. But the Spartans found themselves in a position that wherever they went, they were surrounded by Athenian archers and Athenian slingers. And although they tried to form a phalanx and then move forward to attack the Athenians just retreated and carried on pouring in arrows and slingshots. The Spartans then decided to retreat back up to the top of this hill where they could fortify it and seek further instructions. Unfortunately, as far as the Spartans were concerned, a Messenian, one of the Helots, the Spartan Helots, said that he thought he could possibly get around this little hill here and get above where the Spartans were. And so with Athenian agreement, he then took a small detachment around a coastal route, as you can see, and managed to get himself above the Spartan position. So the Spartans, who had carried out this tactical withdrawal against an onslaught of arrows and onslaught of slingshots, never managing to form a phalanx, never managing to form a front line, never coming to grips with the hoplites, the Athenian hoplites, always coming under bombardment, suddenly found themselves with another group of enemies up on the high ground above them, obviously ready to start the offensive all over again. As soon as they saw that, the Athenian heralds went forward and pointed out to them they were in a precarious position. Contrary to what happened at Thermopylae, the Spartans threw away their shields and came out with their hands up, waving their hands, saying, "That's it, we do not want to fight anymore." These were the sons and grandsons of those that fought at Thermopylae. These are the sons and grandsons of the 300 who gave their lives so willingly. And yet here, for some reason, their whole morale was unlocked and they decided to give up. Well, Thucydides, in his history of the Peloponnesian War, he draws attention to a number of factors. He says, first of all, the Spartans were considerably outnumbered. Lots of archers, I mentioned the hoplites, 800 archers and 800 peltas, the slingers and various others. So they always felt themselves in a position of inferiority. Second, of course, they found themselves surrounded. Wherever they went, there were people overlooking them, firing arrows at them all the time, putting them in a position of perceived weakness. They could never form a phalanx, they could never move forward, they could never engage the enemy. They were just acting as targets. Thirdly, he says, well, no front line, as I mentioned, no front line, no phalanx. And a lot of them were vulnerable because they found, because of the way in which the arrows were coming, since there was no front line, a lot of the arrows are coming in from behind them. So as sort of indicated here, you know, a lot of the arrows are coming in a position in their vulnerable area. Most of them were wounded. And indeed, those that were left behind in the retreat northwards were then butchered by the Athenians, and their cries would have done nothing to reinvigorate the Spartans that remained. But of course, the other thing that was important was the dust and the smoke. Don't forget, this was a place that was full of thorn bushes. So when they formed a phalanx and started going backwards, they're going back through thorn bushes. The whole place had burnt. So as they stamped and moved across the ground, the dust came up. So it was very difficult to look around and see where the enemy was. There was a lot of smoke, so it's difficult to breathe. The noise that the Athenians caused during this particular retreat made it difficult for them to hear orders. So they found it difficult to understand what is going on. And then finally, when they had got back to what they perceived to be their great secure area on top of the hill to the north of the island, just when they thought they were secure, thank God that's over, oh my God, they're up on the hill above us, they're going to start their missile storm all over again. And those, according to Thucydides, is essentially what made the Spartans give up, and give up they did. 292 surrendered, and these became absolutely indispensable as far as the Athenians were concerned, because they were taken to Athens and they were kept there as hostages. Sparta, if you do anything we don't like, guess what's going to happen to your 292 hoplites? And as a coercive strategy, it was extremely successful. So there we have the sort of psychology of these particular people. And it shows that even the Spartans are possibly able to be undermined, to have their morale undermined, and to find themselves in a position of weakness. Well, let's fast forward, and I'm going to fast forward quite a way now to this particular gentleman. Does anyone recognise who that is? Have a quick glance. It's Karl von Clausewitz. Clausewitz was a man who fought in the Prussian army against Napoleon. He fought all the way through the Napoleonic Wars. He was I don't know if he was actually at Waterloo, but he was certainly at Quatre Bras. And after the Napoleonic War, he took over the Staff College, the German Staff College, the Prussian Staff College, and became one of their first commandants. His wife, the Baroness, was intimately involved in what he then wrote, and he wrote the most famous book, Von Krieg, On War. That's all it's called, On War, a discussion on war. And he said a number of things that are really quite important. I should mention those since we have a couple of ladies present. The interesting thing is he unfortunately died of smallpox before he completed the writing, and his wife, the Baroness, then finished it off for him. So we're not too sure, even at this stage, how much is the Baroness and how much is the General. However, we will take it that they all come from von Clausewitz himself, but he said this: war is an act of human intercourse. And it's important to think about war as human intercourse. Even now, while we have robots, UAVs, clever machines, we think, well, maybe war will become depersonalised. But I have to tell you, that is never going to be the case. For the simple reason it's this: it's people that exult in success. People enjoy success, they enjoy victory. People reap the victories, the fruits of victory. Similarly, it is people that pay the price of failure. If you fail, you may lose all your money, you may lose your house, you may lose everything there is, you may even lose your wife and children. You will pay that price if you fail. And so it doesn't matter which robots fight, which champions fight for you. It's you ultimately will pay the final price or enjoy the final victory. So war is an act of human intercourse, and it's important to remember that. But he also went on to say this, that war is an act of force to compel the enemy to do our will. That's what it's all about. I don't have to remind you that if you embark on a warfare, once you've killed somebody, he has no vote. The dead have no vote. It's the people who stand around and watch him die that decide what to do next. Once you're dead, you're dead. Nothing will change that. But it's the people who look and see what happened and how it occurred. They're the people who will make the next decision. And that can be absolutely critical. So war is an act of human intercourse, and it's an act of force to compel the enemy to do our will. Well, why should we study this stuff? And I think I've probably given you a few of the clues. I mean, I've been involved in this for some time. In fact, I was a planner for Gulf War I. And I asked when Gulf War I was starting, and we were doing the planning in the autumn of 1990. what the psychological aspect was. What could we do psychologically to unnerve either Saddam Hussein or the Iraqi people, or indeed the Iraqi army? And I have to tell you, at the time in Britain, we had one person who did psychological warfare and he wasn't available. So that shows you the relative importance as far as the British were concerned. Of course, we had hundreds of people who could tell you how many bombs we needed, but nobody could tell you why we had the bombs. So I think why study this particular thing is because there are a number of enduring truths that need to come out. And of course, it's particularly relevant today because this is what terror is all about. It's all about psychology. A terrorist is not going to take out 50,000 people or 5 million people or 20 million people, or maybe he will if he gets a nuclear weapon, but hopefully that will never occur. Terrorists will kill a few thousand. It's the reactions of everybody else. That's what makes terror successful, because terror is the art of creating fear. Now, I don't have enough time, sadly, to talk too much about strategic bombardment, but I think there are a number of things that I think will be of interest to you when we talk about why now. Let me show you this particular slide. This is an analysis, a little bit like good Dr. Bignaz's calculations this morning. What I'm going to do now is I'm trying to work out a ratio of those who gave up, i.e. deserters and POWs, divided by those killed, okay? So for every person that was killed, how many people sort of gave up? Okay? Well, if you take Korea, well, okay, you can see the numbers, I'm not going to go through them. But the ratio there is 0.38, okay? Vietnam, 0.19, well, pretty similar. There's not a whole lot of difference here. So for the multiplication ratio is not a whole lot different. But then we move on to Gulf War I in 1991. We think that about 10,000 were killed. I mean, you can get any number you like out of this. Some people will tell you it was millions that were killed, but of course that clearly can't be true. Other people will tell you it was 3,000, and that can't be true. For the sake of argument, 10,000 is probably about right. Maybe 1 or even 2,000 either side. Deserters. I'm sure I don't have to remind you that while the war was taking place, there were death squads operating behind the front line. These are Iraqi death squads who were shooting their own people, operating behind the front line, so deserters were liable to be shot. In fact, even the Iraqi death squads found that to be something they couldn't cope with, and so they used to just shoot them in the leg and say, well, off you go, sunshine, and left them in the open. They probably died subsequently, but at least they didn't shoot them outright. But we think about 160,000 probably deserted. But for this calculation, I've used a figure of 100,000, rather less. Well, we know this figure precisely because we counted them, so that was the number of POWs. So when you do the calculation, something happened here, hang on, 0.38, 0.19, 18. Ooh, right. So for every guy that died, 18 gave up, at least. So what we have to ask ourselves was the factor in this, and what made the difference? Well, I'm, as you know, an airman, and of course I would say this. To a large extent, this comes down to the factor that really demotivated the Iraqis. It was seen at the time as being all-powerful, a huge, great surprise. Oh my God, a bit like the chariot on day one of Kadesh. Suddenly as aeroplanes arrived, they didn't expect it to happen, and it was seen as something hugely demotivating because it produced not only physical shock, but huge psychological shock. And I suggest to you it's because it does this thing, it dominates the fourth dimension, which is time. What do I mean by that? Well, Saddam Hussein, I think, if it wasn't him, it was certainly one of his friends, is that Ibrahim or whoever it might have been, characterised Gulf War I as a bit like having to endure a new earthquake every single day. And as soon as you got sorted out on one earthquake, guess what? It happens all again tomorrow, and again tomorrow after that. And so you find yourself not able to react quickly enough because everything is going wrong. The same happens on the front line when people are bombing. Oh my God, we sorted out the bombing, we got rid of the casualties, we got some new people, but it starts all over again. So suddenly you find that everything that you wanted to do has all been concertinaed, all the time has been compressed. Now that can be very successful if you want to make people react in very snapshot, instant decisions. There are times when you don't. And the classic one is the Cuban Missile Crisis, when you will probably remember Curtis LeMay offered to John Kennedy, I can bomb Cuba tomorrow. And Kennedy thought, well, if you concertinas the time, you're going to get irrational decisions. What I actually want to do is to extend the time so they have time to reflect, time to consider. So if you want to squeeze the time, air power will do that. Make you have probably irrational decisions, but snapshot decisions. And indeed, this sort of concept is really brought out in an operation called Operation Strangle that happened in Italy in 1943, when Frido von Sanger and Ettelin, the German general there who was in charge of 14th Panzer Corps, said, "This is a bit like playing a game of chess where the enemy makes 3 moves and I only get to make 1. So they've expanded their time because they got the freedom, and I can only do a little tiny bit, and I can actually only operate at night." So I'm going to mention that in terms of the sort of the psychological effect. Well, let me go through what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about a little bit about World War II, Gulf War. I've already mentioned Cdre, and talk about the Iraq War of 1990-91. I want to then come on to the psychological factors that tend to bring it all together, and finally talk about combat stress, which is essentially what is done to people when you do bomb them and start to impose these sorts of pressure on them. But let me start, I'm going to go on to World War II. I just want to start with a little bit about World War I. Now, you will know that World War I contained many innovations. Of course, the machine gun. That's why these particular characters, these particular characters were in a trench in the first place. Because you couldn't have an open battle line and move forward as Waterloo occurred, or any of the great battles of the 18th and 19th centuries. So they found themselves in defensive fortifications, then you got out and did an attack. The other thing that you may be surprised about, this is actually the first war in which indirect artillery fire was used. Because up until then, just like Waterloo, you got your cannons and you pointed at the enemy and you fired them. Now you are firing up into the air, over the hill, down onto the other side. So these are the sorts of innovations that came to start in World War I, and they started to reflect or push warfare down a particular route. Both of the two I mentioned were exploited by air power. The machine gun was put onto an aeroplane. That is how the aeroplanes then started to use their forward-firing capability. And of course, it was the aeroplane that made the ability for indirect fire by the artillery possible. Because how did you know where the shots were falling unless you had somebody who could look over the top and see where they were going? And so it was really the aeroplane that started to make these two weapon systems useful. And indeed, to begin with, in 1914, most of these people in the trenches in 1914 had never ever seen an aeroplane. Indeed, the first time that they heard an aeroplane, they used to come out of their trenches and look up. Gosh, isn't that fantastic? Wow, look at that, it's amazing. Because, of course, man had only been flying for, 9 years or 11 years by that stage. So a very short space of time. But, of course, it didn't take long for them to realise that as soon as they saw a little pop, 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 pop as the aeroplane went across, it didn't take long before you'd notice that shortly after that the shells would start raining down upon you. And so the respect started almost immediately. Well, in 1916, for the first time, we started to use aircraft, and in fact it was on the Battle of the Somme. We used aircraft for the first time to attack the trenches, using, as you can see, a very highly technologically aimed system like that. The other thing that was used also at the same time was the strafing technique. An aircraft like the Fe-2B, as you can see here, pilot sitting in there, and the captain of the aircraft, who was often the gunner, sitting with the machine gun, and being able to, as they attacked these trenches, go and do a pass on them. What was the effect on the Germans when they first felt it? Well, I have to tell you, it was absolutely outstanding, because the Germans who thought that they were in defensive lines suddenly find that actually the trench, far from keeping them safe, did exactly the opposite. Because if I'm going to do a strafing pass with my gun, guess which direction I'm going to go? I'm going to go along the line of the trench. Dunk, 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 dunk. And quite often, a single pass would kill 30 people. Everybody in that trench was going to die if he got his line up properly and fired down the line of the trench. It presented the target to them in exactly the way that would have been wanted. Well, you can imagine the effect of this on German morale. Oh my God, the last place you want to be now when the aeroplane turns up is in your trench. Because if they do run down the line of the trench, every single person is going to be killed. Now, fortunately, of course, trenches don't go in a straight line from here to eternity. They zigzag a bit, but you find yourself in that particular trench being highly, highly vulnerable. Well, you can imagine it didn't take the Germans long to repeat the operation the other way around, and there's a German 300-kilogram bomb. And then they came on to things like this by 1918, the Möbelwagen, which is the furniture wagon. I mean, this is a very sophisticated aircraft for its time, very rugged, a lot of armament on it, and very effective it was too. So we carried out this strafing, and at the time we identified two forms of strafing. The first of them was trench strafing, the one I just described, and the other one was ground strafing. This was the sort of target you would take out in a ground strafing operation. And you can see how lucrative that would have been to somebody in an aircraft. I mean, a concentration of targets that is impossible to imagine. Well, you can, as I'm sure you will, imagine the effect that this would have had on terms of ability of armies to deploy forward and ability of armies to sustain the front line. But it has to be said, though, that after their first surprise, the Germans in particular suddenly realised that an aircraft flying at 90 miles an hour is not a whole lot more difficult to shoot down than a bird that's in flight. And so they then started to impose losses on the aircraft, and indeed the loss rates for aircraft was extremely high. So it was very effective, but very costly. But what it did do is it meant there was no longer a front line. The front line that had been demarcated on the ground with the trenches didn't exist, because anywhere you got a concentration of people, you were likely to be targeted. Communications were also a problem at the time, but these were gradually being overcome. You can see there, chap there is listening to his radio, but they found that the best method actually was to put the aircraft forward in a semi-autonomous mode and let them just wreak havoc wherever they came. Now, those of you that have heard my lecture before will know that where this particular technique reached its maximum was actually not in Europe, but it was actually here in Palestine. You'll recall that Allenby took Jerusalem around about Christmas Day of 1917, and by the summer of 1918 he was faced with three Turkish armies, 8th, 7th and 4th on the other side of the Jordan. In September of 1917 he was ordered to move forward, and he used his air power with extreme success. He caught the 8th Army, as you can see, at Wadi Zima and strafed them all day as they went down a pass. And then, a couple of days later, there's the second day, on the third day, he managed to find the 7th Army moving down another one of these valleys, the Wadi El Farah, which is there, and managed to hose them down with gunfire and caused all sorts of mayhem. On the third day, the Australians fired 24,000 rounds of machine guns into the Turkish troops that were packed along the Wadi El Farah. The panic and the slaughter of the people who were trying now to move out of the way of the land army beggared all imagination. As a result of this, one could argue that both 8th, 7th and to some extent 4th moved north, ran to Damascus, and psychologically they had given up the will to fight. Certainly it's true that Damascus fell to the Allies within a few weeks. So we start to see some psychological activities here. Strafing, catching people into a situation where they're surprised, amazed at what the Allies are capable of, and using an aeroplane, which is after all something magical, to do this sort of damage. There's Wadi El Farah. Let me now come forward to World War II. I just have to remind you of two things, that during the interwar years, the Allies carried out attacks on surface vessels, you can see. In 1921, they sunk the Ostfriesland, which was a captured German battleship, or battlecruiser, and you can see that it was demonstrated very, very quickly that even the most sophisticated battleship that there is can be destroyed from the air. And you'll also recall something that happened about the same sort of time, a little bit later, was in the Spanish Civil War. This is the Picasso painting of the air attack on Guernica, which achieved such notoriety. But these sort of events set the psychological tone for what was going to happen in World War II. So the question was, what sort of war would this be? Well, at the time, people believed that it was going to be one of those wars where air power would predominate and everything would then give up as soon as a city was attacked. And indeed, if you recall, when Warsaw was attacked, the heart went out of the Polish people to continue the war, and it looked like the same probably happened, as you recall, in Rotterdam as the invasion took place. Well, I don't want to talk too much about that because time doesn't really allow me the luxury of doing so. What I want to concentrate on is still the army in the field. And this, I think, is the first point that one needs to look at. Air power and armour together forming what we now call the Blitzkrieg method of warfare, the sudden strike from the sky. Now, as I'm sure you'll recall, the attack that was mounted against the French I won't go through the sophisticated way in which the battle plans were drawn up. But essentially the Allies were wrong-footed. They believed that the Maginot Line would stop the Germans, except for the route through Belgium. But as it turned out, the Germans actually came through the Ardennes and attacked at Sedan, just as the Germans or the Prussians had done in 1970. You might have thought they were 1870. You might have thought they might have spotted that one, but they didn't. So, on the 10th of May, 1940, the Germans moved up through the Ardennes to position themselves to cross the Meuse on the 13th and 14th of May. The decision was taken that they would use air power to attack every single artillery piece that the French had, to attack all the French positions. The ground troops will come across the little rubber ducky things that you can see there, and air power continuously rained down an offensive. Once the beachhead had been secure, the bridgehead had been secure, the tanks would pour across, and the effect would be as what we now know as Blitzkrieg. Indeed, the sort of effect, as far as the French were concerned, they found that the attacks by the Stukas were concentrated. They weren't just distributed evenly across the line. When the Stukas attacked, they would take out a particular area and concentrate it on. The French found they had no support. So although they had sophisticated guns, they couldn't call up reinforcements. These people were isolated, under air attack, and likely to be attacked very quickly. The French found they were isolated and abandoned. They felt that no one was actually looking after them. No one was giving them support. What then happened was, as the artillery at the back of one of the fortifications on La Marfée, on the west bank of the Meuse, as the artillery then moved, the infantry thought, the artillery are going. And at this stage, there was a sudden feeling of, oh my God, we're going to be outnumbered, surrounded, and we're going to be decimated. And so the infantry gave up and ran. And the next effect was a rout. The Germans poured across, and the effect, of course, we know, was ended up in Dunkirk and then the fall of France. One of the people who was there, a chap called Marc Bloch, wrote this: "Nobody's ever heard the whistling scream made by the dive bombers will ever likely forget the experience. It's not just not only the strident din, but the associated images of death, seeing people lying there dead. No matter how thickly the bombs, they never get more than just a few. But the effect on the nerves, the anticipation of all this, is more than somebody can stand." So these are the sorts of effects that suddenly were being visited upon the Allies. Let's just move now forward quickly to Normandy, to the Western Desert. And I just want to remind you of a couple of things that you will have seen me or maybe heard me talk about last time. Western Desert in 42-43, now the boot is on the other foot, and the Allies are starting to use their air superiority now to do the same sort of thing back to the Germans. I'll give you one example. In 1 week, the RAF flew 10,000 sorties, whereas the Axis powers flew just 3,000. Interestingly enough, the Germans complained that the Allies always had air superiority. The Allies complained that the Germans always had air superiority. And clearly those two positions can't both be right. But nevertheless, that was the sort of psychological effect. But when Rommel wrote in his, when Rommel wrote in his diary, he wrote this: "Officers and men were badly shaken and their fighting capacity reduced by the dispersal, lack of sleep, and the strain of waiting for the bomb." Not a popular thing to write in 1942, because the Africa Corps diary is going to be read in Berlin in a couple of weeks' time. This was not something you really wanted Hitler to have been briefed on, because it didn't, because they were probably doing your job. And in fact, he then went on to say in his own personal diaries this. And this, of course, is very non-PC today, but nevertheless, this is what he wrote. "Under the same handicap and with the same chance of success," i.e. zilch. No chance of success whatsoever. Well, so there we have, this is not just, a Gefreiter sitting in the field. This is, of course, their commanding general. This is Rommel himself that is writing this stuff. And I think it has the sort of the ring of truth when he writes it, and when you look at what he writes later on. So the sort of psychology is there as far as the German ground soldier is concerned, that there is a dominating power here that it's very difficult to fight against. Well, this went on, and I mentioned Operation Strangle right at the beginning, the concentration of time. And this was an attempt by the Allies to take the war into the rear areas and to deny the Germans the capacity to fight because they were deprived of all their sources of war materiel. A very successful campaign it was, but this is the sort of targets that were attacked in this particular campaign. Railways, road. They were forced back to carts and horses, German army unable to move. So you find ourselves in a position that, whereas the Germans, of course, with their panzers want to thrust forward here, thrust forward there, withdraw there, you can imagine the mobile war, they don't have the fuel. They can't move forward, do all these clever things. So that's why the German commanders thought their tactical mobility one of the key factors, or loss of tactical mobility, one of the key factors in their defeat. And indeed, if you then go on to what people have said, this is the war diary, now May 1944, this is still in Italy. Unremitting Allied fighter-bomber activity makes movement impossible. And this is what Frido von Sanger und Ettelin wrote: in the Battle of Movement, commander can only attack the essential movements by night, like a chess player moving one chess piece to 3 moves by the enemy. Now you may say, oh, this is all just pie in the sky, this doesn't reflect the situation on the ground. But what it does reflect is what is going on in your brain. These bastards have the initiative. They can move 3 times every time I try and do something. How can I fight against this? It becomes almost impossible to do so. Let me move forward now straight into Northwest Europe in 1944-45. Learning the lessons of what happened in North Africa, close air support and armed reconnaissance, the Allies started to produce a comprehensive plan. And the first of these was to gain air superiority. And if I tell you that on the day of D-Day, the one day, D-Day itself, 6th of June, the Allies, this includes obviously the Americans and the Poles and everything else, flew 14,000 attack missions. And that was across the beaches and to 100 kilometres behind the front line. 14,000. Well, the day was about 14 hours long, so that's about 1,000 missions an hour. In that whole day, the Germans flew 700 sorties, and that's everywhere in Europe and right across to the Eastern Front. So that sort of says something. And what it says is that when you look up and see that, how many of those are German? Well, if you're an Allied soldier on the ground, you think, oh, that's okay. The RAF and the USAF, they're doing their, or the United States Army Air Corps, they're doing their job, there are lots of airplanes. If you're a German and you sit up and look at that, you know every single one of those is after you. Every single one of those has got rockets and guns and it's waiting to have an opportunity to fire at you. You've got 1,000 missions coming in, and as soon as that 1,000's finished, another 1,000 are going to turn up. And they're just waiting. So you end up in a situation where this air superiority is turned into a form of air dominance. At the same time, weapon accuracy was improving, so that was also increasing the stress on people. And that's reflected very much in, let me give you a quote from it's the German medical reports at the end of the war, and it says this: prior to 1943, infantry weapons were the leading cause of casualties, the artillery second and aircraft third. During 1944 and 45, aerial weapons were far ahead of the artillery or infantry as a cause of casualties in the German armed forces. It's not civilians in, I don't know, Dresden or Bremen or wherever it might be. This is the German armed forces. So air power has moved into dominance in terms of its ability to destroy things on the ground. And psychologically, that has to have an effect. But of course, even then, even though they had air dominance, remember at night, the Allies could not use their fighter bombers. So night was the one time that the Germans could operate. So we end up in a situation where these things dominate the day and have complete control of the tanks that are brought in to fight. Well, this is reflected by this chap, commander of the Panzerlehr division, Fritz von Bayerlein. Panzerlehr was a crack German division, and it's a Panzer division, you can see that as well. It was somewhere down near Lyon at the start of D-Day. It was moved from the south all the way up into the war zone, and it fought with some distinction, as it turned out, once it came into contact. But on the way north, as it says there, the number of men who survived the pattern bombing surrendered soon to the attacking infantry or escaped to the rear. That's not so good if you're a commander of a crack panzer division, these people are giving up. And they said the uselessness of fighting, only the particularly strong nerve could endure this particular strain. And indeed, the real effect seen by the typhoons occurred at this battle, the Battle of Morton, which occurred, as you can see, 1200 hours, August the 7th. Thank you very much. What basically happened is that the Allies were moving down to the south, and the Germans, their only opportunity to impact on the movement down to the south was to bring up a number of panzer divisions, and you can see them up there. Each one of these is a tank division. So that's tank division, tank division, tank division, tank division, tank division. That's infantry with the X on it, so 3 infantry divisions. And you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tank divisions. And so on the August the 7th, the counter-attack then began, and they punched through at this place called Mortain. At this time, there were very, very few troops here. Most of the troops themselves, the Allied troops, were quite a long way forward. And so it looked quite likely that the panzers would cut off and create an encircling movement for the forces that had moved forwards. The only option, really, was to attack them using typhoons. So the typhoons were sent in. I think some of you told me it's the Tempest, but they're pretty much the same sort of thing. Typhoons were sent in, and during the course of the morning, they found that it was almost impossible to fly because of the low cloud and fog. But by lunchtime, when the weather cleared, these things then rained an attack on all the panzers they found. And as Eisenhower recorded in his journal after the battle had taken place, these typhoons destroyed 83 tanks, probably destroyed a further 29, and damaged a further 24, in addition to the large quantities of soft-skin motor transport. Some 294 sorties were flown. The Luftwaffe were ordered to support at maximum effort, but virtually all of them were shot down as they lifted off from their airfields. As far as the Germans were concerned, their last throw of the battle to stop the bridgehead from breaking out had failed, and it was stopped by these. The net effect was that the 7th Army, which had become squeezed, you can see Mortain, I can't see it now, there it is there, become squeezed because at this stage Patton was moving down to the south, found themselves in a pocket known as the Falaise Gap. And it was in the Falaise Gap that as the noose slowly but surely tightened, so the Germans found themselves increasingly squeezed, and once they were fixed like this, they became targets, not an army in the field. All concentrated into a nice little pocket, ideal tank-killing area. So the noose tightened, the army compressed, fewer and fewer roads, continuous air attack. And so what did they do? They dropped their weapons and ran. And so when you see pictures of the Falaise Gap, you find an awful lot of abandoned vehicles, abandoned tanks, abandoned material, some people surrendering, but most of them have just given up and run. So a very similar sort of situation to what was happening with the Spartans. Well, what was the overall effect? Well, as you can imagine, German troops were becoming increasingly demoralised by this overwhelming air capability. First of all, there were things like hot Strangle, and of course that was also going on in Normandy, and then of course there was Normandy proper. So you can end up in a situation where the sense had come through, do not move by day. And in fact, whole divisions, when it came towards daytime, would move under cover and stay so they couldn't be seen. So that division did not perform that particular day. At night they could then creep forward again. Do not move by day. So they would just hide. So let's just have a look at some of the effects. Well, concealment. Yeah, conceal yourself. Hide yourself away. Make sure nobody notices you. But then you come on to the next thing. I found this in fact, it's a translation from a German book. This is obviously a German motorbike rider. The apprehensive glance skyward epitomises the all-embracing effect of Allied air supremacy. But the common thing that was said at the time by these people is, wo ist die Luftwaffe? Here we are fighting and dying, moving forward with our tanks, doing what the Führer's ordered. Where's the bloody Air Force? What have they done? You know, why aren't they here supporting us? Why should we have to endure all the punishment all by ourselves? So there's a sense of betrayal. Where is the Luftwaffe? And then, of course, you'll remember I mentioned Rommel already. But this is a letter that he wrote to his wife. I have to say, if I wrote to my wife, you know, this sort of stuff, she'd throw it away. But this is what he wrote to his wife. So it has the sense of not just something that's for public consumption. This is what he actually told his wife. The air superiority has a very grave effect on our movements. There's simply no answer to it. And when you psychologically get to the point where you say there is no answer to it, you've gone a long way psychologically to deciding you're defeated. There's no answer to it. There's no way of getting out of this particular situation. In fact, it echoes a letter written by von Kluge to Hitler about a week later after Rommel himself, of course, you recall, was strafed by a typhoon. And von Kluge said the same sort of thing. So a sense of hopelessness, there's simply no answer to it. And if that needed emphasising, well, things like the Falaise Gap rather brought it home, because you end up in that sort of situation. But the Germans thought they had an answer to this overwhelming dominance by the fighter bombers. And it went something like this. The Germans were told, if they come under fighter bomber attack, get out of your vehicles and run. Well, that was fine. Typhoon comes down, takes out the vehicles, pulls off, notices the troops in the field, goes around again, comes in, then hoses down the troops in the field. That didn't work. Next good idea. Let's tell the guys that when they get out of their vehicles to get underneath the vehicles, because they get some protection from the vehicles. Well, that doesn't work, because there are armour projectiles that the Typhoons are firing. They go straight through the vehicle, out the outside, blow the troops up underneath. Next good idea. Get out of your vehicles and go and find somewhere to hide. Well, that's fine, except that as your vehicles are moving forward, there probably aren't too many places to hide. So you still get attacked on the second time round. So this word went round the Wehrmacht. Very soon, we will be told to take on the fighter bombers with our pocket knives. You know, we've tried all the stupid ideas. Let's think of something that's even more stupid. It's totally pointless and totally futile. So you end up in a sense here of pointlessness. You know, there's simply no answer to it, and it's jolly futile. There is no point in doing this. We're being told all sorts of nonsense. But you can, of course, go one stage too far. And that is, if you tell somebody he's going to die, and it doesn't matter what he does, you're still going to kill him, then he might just as well fight you like a cornered rat, because he's got nothing to lose, and by God, I'll take some of these bastards with me. And so at that particular stage, you end up in a situation where he's going to fight you right to the last minute, because at least he'll get some satisfaction. So in the way in which this whole build-up of psychological pressures work, if you go too far, they'll fight you to the death. And of course, to some extent, that was what was beginning to happen at Stalingrad, until suddenly the Russians realised they've got to give these guys a way out, because otherwise we'll have the whole of the 6th Army, von Paul's 6th Army, fighting us for every single corner. And so the point does become that although you can have all the psychological pressures, you must not create that sort of situation. Well, let me now fast forward, and I want to talk about the Gulf War of 1991, and I'm not going to go through this in too much detail, except to say that, of course, this was the first war when precision-guided munitions were used for the first time. You know, this is the Iraqi Air Force headquarters. You recall this sort of picture. I mean, at the time, everybody said, how the hell can they do this? And it seemed almost unbelievable that, unlike the Typhoons who could only fire their gun and get the sort of accuracies, now with a bomb, we could put a bomb onto a hardened aircraft shelter, and it was pretty much guaranteed to hit. What was the effect? Well, a lot of things sort of came up. We didn't have the effect from the strategic area that we thought, but the effect really came from the army, the Iraqi army in the field. And they found the attacks by the Allied aircraft absolutely devastating. There was a sort of synergy with the psychological operations that were taking place, and I'll just mention those very quickly. So that's the number of precision weapons at the fire. We ended up doing a thing called tank plinking, and let me just describe to you that very briefly, what that is. F-111 aircraft would arm up with 4 laser-guided bombs. They'd take off at 6 o'clock at night, they go up into the Kuwaiti theatre of operations, come across the Iraqi tanks, put the first crosshairs down on the first tank, drop the first bomb, direct hit. Okay, on to the next one, direct hit. Okay, round over here, direct hit. Oh, near miss. Well, pretty close, that's good enough. Probably done the damage, go home. Get another 4 laser-guided bombs, get airborne now at 8 o'clock, go into the slot and carry on the process. This became known as tank plinking, because it was like a game of Space Invaders. That became known to the Iraqis, and they found it highly demotivating. And in fact, General Schwarzkopf then insisted that this word was never to be used again. Not because he objected to it being used against the Iraqis, but because it was demotivating our own tank crews. They were thinking, oh my God, if it's that easy, perhaps they're going to do this to us. So that was the sort of capability that was being visited upon them. In fact, let me leave this, because otherwise we'll go through it. The effect was that some 87,000 surrendered, 150,000 diverted, and it was a walkover with minimal casualties on both sides. Let me just show you one of the reasons why this sort of thing worked out. Well, we did apply physical stress to them. We did this. We cut them off. We made sure the Iraqi army had no communications, no water, no food, and no information. For most of the Iraqi soldiers, they were attacked every 3 hours, The attacks by the air power was unanswerable and devastating. There was absolutely nothing they could do for it. In addition, this was then amplified by the psychological operations, but of course it's really the combination of what I described, the death and these things, that really had the effect. Volant solo, transmitting on the radio frequencies to the Iraqis in the field, who were listening to radios that had been dropped purposely by us so they could listen to our transmissions. You can see lots of leaflets were dropped. You can see the sort of messages there. A B-52 dropping bombs. The 16th Division will be bombed tomorrow. Leave this location now and save yourselves. And this was dropped in huge numbers. So much so that some Iraqis said you couldn't see the sand because it was just covered in these particular devices, these particular leaflets. This was then dropped after the event. We've informed you of our promise, so we've kept our promise. Bombend yesterday, look out, because guess what? Tomorrow it's your turn. And this was the stage where many of the Iraqi forces in the field suddenly recalled they had a dental appointment at Baghdad tomorrow, and off they went to see the dentist. And so you've got an awful lot who realised, having seen the success of what happened yesterday, or even indeed this morning, when they received this, which is essentially a contract, tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, I'm going to kick your head in. When they received this message, they knew that it was true. They knew that at 10 o'clock, plus or minus a minute, they're going to die. And that is pretty demotivating, particularly when you know there's nothing you can do about it, there's no way you can fight against it, and there's no way of managing to overcome it. The psychological operations information, I mean, this is the sort of exposure. So radio broadcast, 58% were exposed. Persuasiveness, you can see that. It was leaflets that really had the effect. And you can see that 70% found themselves induced to surrender, and virtually all of them had seen the leaflets. But the weapons that they really disliked as much as anything else were things like the B-52, dropping 72 750-pounders out of each B-52. 3 of these things could drop the same amount of artillery power as a corps of artillery. So these things would arrive, let's say, every 3 hours and take out something. Very effective indeed, and very, very frightening. I'll leave that. So the effect that we had, let me just get off there. The psychological effect that we had was really this. The idea of bombing, then leafletting, then bombing, got inside the minds of the people who were subjected to it. This created in turn this sort of sense of anticipatory fear. I have seen what has happened, and this is now going to happen to me, and there's nothing I can do about it. But at the same time, we provided a leadership substitute, because we said to the Iraqis, this is not a battle against you, this is a battle against Saddam Hussein. Leave your trenches, walk in the direction of Jeddah, and we will take care of you, we will give you water and food, and we will repatriate you with honour. So essentially we gave them a way out, and that was most important, because we didn't want to get them into a position where, like a cornered rat, they were going to fight to the death. So what did the POWs think about this? Well, these are some of the comments that they made. PSYOP leaflets produced the highest threat to morale, second only to the Allied bombing. I would say he's rather missed the point, this particular chap, because it's the combination of the leaflets and the bombing that has the effect that we're talking about. Officers and men felt resistance was futile, as they were against the world. Radio reports of B-52 bombings caused desertions. And the PSYOP campaign told the soldiers to leave their vehicles to avoid injury. It proved what George Bush had said about not fighting the Iraqi people. And the weapons that really the Iraqis disliked, the B-52 I've mentioned, the A-10 because it was always there, and F-11 as well, and the leaflets. They hated the fact that neither the aeroplanes turned up or indeed the leaflets were dropped. So what were the effects? Well, the enemy was always there, and that's what the Iraqis kept on harping on about. Every 3 hours, some more aeroplanes would turn up. The Iraqis felt they couldn't affect the battle. There's nothing they could do. It doesn't matter whether they got up in the morning, didn't get up in the morning, stayed in their trenches. They couldn't affect the outcome of the battle in the slightest degree. In the Iran-Iraq war, they lived in their tanks. But as I've described in tank blinking, tanks had a nasty habit of just blowing up, because obviously they were hit. And then there was this one here, the B-52 bombs that arrived. They were guided by the will of Allah. There was nothing they could do to influence them in one way or another. And finally, there was this feeling that resistance was utterly futile. I just want to bring now these 3 campaigns to to a point, and just before I go on and look at very briefly in the last few minutes at the sort of stresses and so forth. So if you let me just flash through, I'll come to one I particularly want to. This shows you what happened in Gulf War II, which is also a similar sort of effect. But I think right. Let's just go through some of the effects that we discussed. So here we are with the Spartans and Thucydides commenting on them. The Spartans felt themselves outnumbered, which was true, they were. In World War II, the Germans, well, they hid by day to avoid the fact that they were outmaneuvered, outnumbered by the Allied air power. And in Gulf War I, the enemy was all pervasive. So huge asymmetry in capability. We're outnumbered. What about this one? Surrounded, no front line, can't form a phalanx. We've got to get a phalanx together, because once we can form the phalanx, we can advance on the enemy. Well, you can't, because every direction you look, there are bloody archers all over the place. Where's the Luftwaffe? We can't do anything because bloody aeroplanes keep arriving. Sense of betrayal. And here we have the Iran-Iraq war, the tank was my friend. So all the expectations that you have that really come out of this are all set at zero. We expect to be able to fight a war, form a front line, form a phalanx. We expect to fight another conventional battle, but the Luftwaffe is stopping it. And now, every time I get in the tank, it blows up. Then we come on to the physical factors. The thorn bushes, the dust, the smoke, the noise you can't hear. World War II, same sort of sense of hopelessness. I can't fight against this, it's just not possible. And again, somebody else is controlling. So these are sort of the physical things that I can't really control. And then you come on to the next thing, vulnerability, lots of wounds. Fight the fighter bombers with your pocket knives. Resistance is futile. Impotence. I cannot affect the battle. A sense of pointlessness. And so you end up in a situation where down to there, they're all positive, and then you get into the surprise and panic. Fine. Surprise and panic, they gave up. Falaise, they all gave up and ran away. And Basra, you recall, they all gave up and ran away. So down to that point, we've had a position where we've considerably seen commonality of sort of experiences of armed men in the field being attacked by some sort of capability that is far greater than themselves. But let's not forget the rage phenomenon, and that still is there. It didn't occur in that particular campaign, didn't it? Occur in that campaign. But that phenomenon is always there wherever we go and wherever we find ourselves. And any commander who doesn't notice that or forgets to take due account of that is probably going to set himself up. Well, let me talk about the psychology of war, and I think you've probably got some of these messages, so I should be able to go through them quickly. Everybody has his limit. Everybody in this room can be undermined. And if you look in your heart of hearts, I don't know if there are any particular heroes here, but I can tell you, I certainly know I have my limits. I've been interrogated and I've been to war. And there are some things I could tolerate and some things I couldn't tolerate. I frankly would never want to be captured. I probably would commit suicide rather than be captured if I had the option. But for everybody, you have a limit, and it varies between your age, your culture, and indeed your personality. Ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, you are animals. And you will perform quite often as animals. And there's nothing you can do about that. If something nasty happened, if a ghost suddenly appeared, oh my God, you'd have all sorts of weird reactions. But they would be very animalistic, very zoological. These are the sorts of things, if I can get it to change, are the sorts of things that cause the difficulties. Claustrophobia, noise, isolation, fatigue, climate and terrain, discomfort, hygiene, idleness, you can see them all through there. Helplessness, ignorance, past defeats, casualties. Those are the things that if you are finding yourself under stress, those are the things that will make your situation worse and worse and worse. So what do we get out of this? We've put these people under stress, we've given them all sorts of nasty experiences. What you then get out of that is what's known as a combat stress reaction, which is the sort of event that occurs to individuals when things go very wrong. So you cease to function, or you function in a highly extreme manner. The symptoms are, well, we've all been through these, because actually a combat stress reaction is not a whole lot different to being at school having to take an exam, particularly one you haven't studied for particularly well. Sort of reactions: anxiety, trembling and sweating, depression, tears, of course, suicide. You then move on to some of the more interesting ones: dissociation. A lot of people who find themselves in an extremely difficult situation pretend they're not there. At the most extreme, we found this with some of the Iraqis, when they came under air attack, they would go and sit in the corner down there somewhere and just adopt the fetal position. waiting for it to finish. I'm not really here. I'm just a little mouse. Because that was the only way they could cope with the sort of stress. They would just remove themselves physically, but psychologically mostly, out of the way. So the next one you get, now, motor changes and hysteria. And this is typically demonstrated by somebody who goes berserk. This used to happen a lot in the trenches in World War I. I can't take it anymore, and they'd run up onto the parapet and be shot by the first machine gun. But that's the sort of things that can happen. Then you move on to the more sort of deep-seated ones, stupor. Somebody eventually becomes unconscious, and finally you end up with some sort of psychotic reactions. Down to about here, these are reversible. So probably even to dissociation means some of those, you can reverse that by taking the guy out of the front line. Once you get onto this sort of level and beyond, you've probably unlocked the guy's brain. He's no longer functioning as a human being. He's probably a basket case of one sense or another. So, I'm going to leave this because the time is not on my side, but if you'll, I just want to come forward to one thing. If you want to carry out attacks on people and inflict this sort of stress, then it's important that when you do it, you understand what the enemy's values are, what really unhinges him, and you also understand what his expectations are. What did the Spartans expect when they were at Cdre? They thought they were going to form a phalanx and drive the Athenians off. Be a bloody battle, okay. But that's what they expected. When they got the unexpected, that was no good, because the expectations were considerably exceeded. So, when you do this, you must work this out and exceed whatever expectations he had, because then you will start to get some return. You need also to demonstrate, if you're going to do the psychological bit, that you are omniscient and omnipotent. There's no point, for example, in saying to the 16th Division in Kuwait, guess what, we're going to kick your head in or blow your lights out at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, and then to drop your bombs in the wrong place. Or to turn up at 10:30 and miss the target. You've got to demonstrate you are capable and you know what you're doing. And then you, of course, have all the cards. He, on the other hand, has no capability at all. And it doesn't take him long to realise if he is impotent, then he's in a situation of hopelessness. Now, hopelessness by itself doesn't sort of just says, oh, well, this is hopeless, I'll wait till it goes away. But what you've then got to do is create in his mind the concept of futility, of pointlessness. You are cannon fodder. Your dying achieves nothing. You are here just to die. And if you can get that message through to him, then you will have done your work, because then people will understand exactly where they stand. But the final thing, of course, if you're going to do psychological warfare, is you must always, when you're conducting stressful activities, is give the bloke a way out. Because if you don't, then any enemy you have will fight you and fight you hard and fight you to the last ounce of his being, because he's going to take you with him, and it's just payback time. So there, ladies and gentlemen, is it. I'll put that back up again. That is all I'm going to say. Let's break for 10 minutes and start back up at 4 o'clock, and we'll now move it from the psychological, tactical, up to the interstate level, and see if these sorts of things, see if the Spartan effects at Thermopylae and Cdre actually relate to the way states start to see their behaviour. So thanks very much. Let's move on.